If you grew up in Britain in the early 1990s, the Jaguar XJ220 was probably on your bedroom wall. Long, low, impossibly wide, and, for a few glorious years, the fastest production car in the world. It was hand-built by a few hundred people in a quiet Oxfordshire village, and it humbled every Ferrari and every Lamborghini on Earth, timed at 217 miles an hour. 1,500 people had begged to buy one, sight unseen. It won its class at Le Mans. It was Britain's answer to Italy, the crowning glory of a reborn Jaguar. And then, within a few short years, the fastest car in the world had become the most toxic name in motoring. Unsold, unwanted, gathering dust. How does the fastest car ever built, a car people fought one another to own, become a car nobody wanted? What on earth went wrong? Chapter 1. The Queue and the Writ. Birmingham, the autumn of 1988. Under the hard white lights of the National Exhibition Centre, a silver car sat on a turntable, and for a moment the hall around it went quiet. Then it didn't. Then it roared. Nobody had asked for this car. No committee had commissioned it. No marketing department had modelled its sales. No accountant had signed off its budget. It had been built, in large part, in secret, after hours by volunteers, out of borrowed parts and called-in favours. And now, here it stood, low and impossibly wide, its doors rising into the air like something out of a boy's bedroom drawing, a transparent panel at the tail showing off the great V12 engine beneath. The man who had imagined it was called Jim Randall. He was Jaguar's director of vehicle engineering, a quiet, precise Midlander who would always rather solve a problem than talk about one. He had not built this car to sell it. He had built it to prove something. And within hours, the decision had been taken out of his hands. In a single day, roughly 1,500 people tried to give Jaguar £50,000 each. There were 350 places. That is not a waiting list. That is a stampede, oversubscribed 4 times over, in an afternoon, for a car that did not yet exist, that no one had driven, that carried no firm price. Checkbooks came out on the show floor. Names were begged onto lists. Men in good suits leaned across the barriers to ask how, exactly, one guaranteed a place. The name itself was a promise. XJ220, 220 miles an hour, the target top speed, a figure chosen to echo the XK120 of the late 1940s, which in its own day had been the fastest production car on Earth. Jaguar was reaching back into its own legend and vowing to do it all again. David Boole, Jaguar's Director of Public Affairs, later reckoned the concept had thrown off something like £10 million of free publicity in a single month. A car that had cost almost nothing to dream up had become, overnight, the most talked-about object in Britain. And then, in time, the turn. 5 years later, the same company that those people had queued to pay began issuing writs against them. Jaguar took its own customers to court. Wealthy men who had once fought to hand over their deposits now fought to claw them back, and Jaguar, coldly and completely, won. That is the shape of the story, a dream so seductive that strangers threw money at it sight unseen, and a reckoning so bitter that it ended in the High Court. Somewhere between those 2 points lies everything this film is here to understand. The title promises you a single mistake, one fatal decision, one act of corporate arrogance that took the fastest car in the world and destroyed it. It is a clean, satisfying story, and it is the story that was told about the XJ220 for the best part of a decade. But when you follow the record carefully, decision by decision, year by year, the villain you were promised keeps failing to appear. There was no single mistake. There was something more complicated than a villain, and in the end more sorrowful. A car conceived as an act of pure engineering love, arriving into a world that had abruptly stopped loving it. It begins, as the best of these stories do, not in a boardroom, but with one stubborn engineer and a piece of cardboard. Chapter 2. The Saturday Club. James Neville Randall was born in April 1938, and he came up the hard, proper way, through the workshop, not the boardroom. He served his apprenticeship at Rover, where he cut his teeth on the P6, one of the finest saloons Britain ever built. He learned engineering the way a craftsman learns a trade, with his hands on real metal, answerable always to whether the thing actually worked. In 1965, he joined Jaguar as a development engineer on the XJ Saloon, and there he found both his home and his master. The master was Bob Knight, Jaguar's great engineering conscience, the man who had made Jaguars ride and hush the way no rival could manage. Randall became his deputy, then his protégé, and by 1980 he had risen to director of vehicle engineering, the man ultimately responsible for how a Jaguar felt to drive. He did not look the part of a supercar visionary. Colleagues remembered him as diffident, soft-spoken almost to the point of shyness, a man who chose his words the way he chose his tolerances, carefully and with nothing wasted. But beneath the quiet, there was a dry, wicked sense of humour, and beneath that, again, there was steel. He flew light aircraft in his spare time. He was, in every sense that mattered, a man who liked to find out how far a thing could be pushed before it broke. And he was about to push Jaguar further than anyone had dared in a generation. To understand what he did, you have to understand the moment he did it in. In 1984, Jaguar had been set free, floated on the stock market, cut loose at last from the slow suffocation of British Leyland. The company stood on its own for the first time in years, shielded for a while by a government golden share that held any hostile takeover at bay. Under its chairman, John Egan, a starved and demoralized firm had begun, cautiously, to remember its own worth. Quality climbed, sales climbed, pride climbed, and engineers who had spent the lean years being told there was no money for anything suddenly found there might, at last, be a little room to dream. Egan's revival was not a slogan, it was measurable. Warranty claims fell. Cars that had once been a national joke began winning back buyers who had sworn they would never be burned again. The company that had been a candidate for quiet euthanasia under British Leyland was, within a few short years, profitable, floated, and proud. It was precisely the kind of turnaround that gives an ambitious engineer the nerve to reach for something audacious. But they had learned, in the hardest way, not to trust management with their dreams. To have been a Jaguar engineer through the 1970s was to carry a particular kind of grief. The mark that once meant grace and pace and effortless speed had become a byword for cars that rusted in the showroom and stopped on the hard shoulder, a small jewel bolted to the flank of a vast, failing conglomerate, starved of investment, its good name bleeding away year on year. Men who knew precisely how to build a great car had been made to stand and watch. Powerless, as the badge they loved was dragged down with everything else. That memory left a mark. It bred a wariness of boardrooms and budgets and committees, the places where good ideas so often went to die, and it explains, more than anything, what Randall chose to do next. If the front door was going to be closed to him, he would go round the back. By 1988, the recovery had climbed to a height nobody could have predicted a decade earlier. Jaguar was posting record sales. That June, a Jaguar had won the 24 Hours of Le Mans outright. Its first victory there in more than 30 years, though, tellingly, the winning car had been built and run not in Coventry at all, but by a lean, ferociously effective Scottish racing team competing under Jaguar's colours. The marque was winning again, selling again, believed in again. It was, by almost any measure, the finest year Jaguar had known since Sir William Lyons himself walked the floor. And it was into that rising tide of confidence that Jim Randall chose to launch his impossible car. The idea had first come to him around Christmas of 1984, a mid-engined Jaguar, a car to win Le Mans again. Not with an outside team, but in-house, the way the C-types and D-types had won it in the 1950s, when Jaguar's green cars owned the long straights of the Sarthe. A road car with a racer's heart. For a Jaguar man of Randall's generation, Le Mans was not a race. It was scripture. Between 1951 and 1957, Jaguar's C-types and D-types had won the 24 Hours 5 times over, turning a modest Coventry firm into a name spoken with reverence across Europe. That was the summit of everything the marque believed about itself, that it could meet the world's best on the world's hardest circuit and beat them, with cars that happened also to be beautiful. 3 decades on, that glory had faded into black and white photographs and the memories of older men. Randall wanted to make it colour again. He was not the first Jaguar man to chase this particular ghost. Back in the 1960s, in that same restless spirit, Jaguar had secretly built a mid-engined V12 racer of its own, the XJ13, a car of such heartbreaking beauty that grown men fell silent in front of it, designed to carry the green into battle against Ferrari at Le Mans. It never raced. The rules changed, the moments slipped away, and then, during a high-speed test at Mira in 1971, it crashed and was very nearly destroyed. Rebuilt, it was quietly locked away. A magnificent might-have-been, a Jaguar Le Mans dream that history had refused to let come true. Randall knew that car intimately. In a real sense, the XJ220 was his reply to it. The promise the XJ13 had never been allowed to keep. He turned the idea over for 3 years, and then, over the Christmas holiday of 1987, he built the first version of it with his own hands. A quarter-scale model, in cardboard, worked out on his kitchen table while the rest of the country was pulling crackers. He took it to the board. The board said no. There was no budget for a fantasy. So, Randall built it anyway. He gathered 11 other engineers who believed in it as fiercely as he did, 12 men in all, and they began to meet in the evenings and at weekends on their own time, for no extra pay. They called themselves, with the flat understatement of the English Midlands, the Saturday Club. What they were attempting was, by any sober measure, close to absurd, to design and build a complete, running, four-wheel drive V12 supercar in their spare hours, without official sanction, and very nearly without official knowledge. Picture one of those evenings. The main factory dark and cooling, the day shift long gone home. A corner of the works still lit, a dozen tired men, jackets off, working through a packaging problem on a car nobody had told them to build, where to route the drivetrain, how to make the doors clear the wheel arches, how to fit a full racing V12 and drive to all four wheels into a shape low enough to be beautiful. They were not being paid for this. They could, in truth, have got into trouble for it. They did it because the alternative, to let the idea die in a meeting, as so many ideas had, was unthinkable to them. This was the pride of the BL years turned into action. This was the front door closed and the back door found. They could not build a whole car out of goodwill alone, so Randall did the only thing left open to him. He went out and asked for favours. He telephoned round some 40 suppliers across the British motor industry and made each of them the same quiet, honest offer. Help me build this for nothing now, and I will give you the credit in public and the promise of work to come. Astonishingly, they said yes. Wheels, brakes, glass, trim, electronics, the countless small components that add up to a motor car, donated on a handshake and a hope. An entire supercar assembled on trust. For the shape of it, Randall turned to Keith Helfet, a South African who had come up through the Royal College of Art to become Jaguar's senior sports car designer. Helfet offered him 2 directions. One echoed the hard, functional lines of a Porsche 956 racer. The other was softer, more sculptural, unmistakably a Jaguar. Randall chose the second because, he said, it looked more obviously like what it was. It looked like a cat. For the four-wheel drive, he went to men who understood it better than almost anyone alive. Tony Rolt and his son Stuart, of FF Developments. Tony Rolt was no ordinary engineer. He had won Le Mans outright in 1953, at the wheel of a Jaguar C-Type, and he had been one of the minds behind the Jensen FF, the first road car in the world to drive all 4 of its wheels. The bloodline of the XJ220's most ambitious feature ran straight back through British motoring history to a Le Mans-winning Jaguar. And for the engine, they reached for one of the great racing units of the age, a 4-valve version of the V12 developed under the legendary Walter Hassan, of which only 5 then existed anywhere on Earth, their connecting rods made of titanium. Set down plainly, the specification was almost provocative. A mid-mounted V12 driving all 4 wheels is a fearsomely awkward thing to engineer. The power has to be threaded through and around the engine to reach the front axle, in a car already low and packed tight. The doors did not open outwards, but swung up towards the sky, a piece of theatre that still had to be made to work, and seal and shut with a reassuring weight. The whole machine was as wide as a small van and barely taller than a man's waist. This was no styling exercise dressed up as a supercar. It was a serious attempt to build the most technically ambitious road car in the world, and to build it, remember, out of borrowed parts and stolen evenings. There was no money for a full-size mock-up, so the aerodynamics were shaped at the Mira wind tunnel using that same quarter-scale model. Everything about the project was improvised, borrowed, done on the cheap and done in the dark. The most extraordinary Jaguar ever conceived was, in that moment, effectively contraband, an unofficial car that nobody in authority had ordered, taking form in the shadows of Brown's Lane after the last of the day shift had clocked out. The smell of a development shop on a Saturday morning. Cold metal, old oil, strong tea going lukewarm in enamel mugs. A dozen quiet, happy men fitting a Le Mans engine into a machine the board still did not know they were building. It should not have worked. It worked. Chapter 3. A Dream You Could Buy. By the summer of 1988, the car was becoming real, and word of it could no longer be kept in the shadows. It needed to be shown. Randall set his sights on the British International Motor Show at the NEC in Birmingham that October, the largest stage in the British motoring calendar. There was just one difficulty. The chairman had never seen it. By the accounts that survive, John Egan first laid eyes on the finished concept only about 8 days before it was due to be revealed to the world. Whatever passed through him in that moment, alarm, delight, some breathless collision of the two, he gave it his blessing. The contraband car was cleared for the spotlight. What the crowd saw on the 18th of October 1988 had no equal in the hall. The bodywork was aluminium, hand-formed by park sheet metal, beaten and wheeled into a shape that seemed to have been poured rather than built. Long, low and wide as a doorway, the surfaces flowing over the wheels like water finding its level. The doors rose upward on their hinges. Through a transparent cover at the rear, that rare racing V12 sat on open display, like a jewel behind glass, 6.2 litres of it, around 500 brake horsepower, quad cam, titanium veined. Beneath the whole car ran four-wheel drive from Rolt's FF Developments, and inside, wrapped around the heart of a race car, was Connolly leather, the scent of an English gentleman's club draped over the bones of a Le Mans machine. It stopped people where they stood. Then it took their breath, and then it took their money. The reaction was not merely admiration, it was closer to disbelief. Photographers climbed over one another for an angle. The motoring press, hard men who had seen every wonder the industry could produce, reached for superlatives they normally kept under lock and key. Here was a British car from a company that only a few years before had been a national embarrassment, that made the finest of Italy and Germany look suddenly ordinary. It was the star of the show before the show had properly opened its doors, and by the following morning, its silver shape was on front pages that had nothing to do with cars. And the promise beneath the spectacle was staggering. Jaguar spoke of a top speed beyond 200 miles an hour, the magic figure the name itself demanded. No production car had ever been built to travel so fast. In one silver shape, the company was laying claim to the outright crown. Not the most beautiful car, not the most expensive, but the fastest road car on the planet. Full stop. For a nation that had spent a decade being told its industry was finished, it was intoxicating. Britain was going to build the quickest car in the world, and hundreds of people wanted to own a piece of it before the ink on the drawings was dry. The scale of what happened next was something Jaguar had not remotely anticipated. For 350 planned cars, some 1,500 people came forward, in a single day, each brandishing a deposit of £50,000. The price, when it finally came, was expected to land somewhere between £290,000 and £360,000, sums that in 1988 would buy a very good house, or several. It made not the slightest difference. Demand ran at 4 times supply before the exhibition had even packed away its stands. On the stand itself, the scenes bordered on unseemly. Salesmen who had come to Birmingham expecting polite inquiries found themselves besieged. People wanted to know where to sign and how soon, and whether £50,000 today might buy a better place in the queue than £50,000 tomorrow. There was, running through all of it, a faint whiff of panic, the fear of missing out, made flesh in a crowd of well-dressed people, all reaching for the same 350 tickets. And here is the detail that tells you what was truly going on. David Boole, the same man who had watched £10 million of free publicity roll in, admitted afterwards that Jaguar had tried to sift its buyers, to separate the genuine enthusiasts from the opportunists. They had tried, and they had largely failed. A good number of the people pressing checks into Jaguar's hands, Boole conceded, were simply speculators after a quick profit. The car had barely been born, and it was already being bought by people who had no intention of ever keeping it. Some of the names were dazzling. The 57th order on the list belonged to Elton John. Further down, and with varying degrees of certainty, sat the Sultan of Brunei and his brother, Prince Geoffrey, men for whom £50,000 was a rounding error. And, so the story runs, the racing impresario Flavio Briatore. This was the guest list of a car that had transcended being a car. It had become a passport, a trophy, a way of signalling that you were among the anointed few for whom the ordinary rules of scarcity did not apply. But the true engine of the frenzy was not glamour. It was arithmetic. To grasp why 1,500 people would gamble £50,000 on a machine they had never seen, you have to understand the strange fever then gripping the exotic car market at the close of the 1980s. After the stock market crash of 1987, money that had been scorched in shares came looking for somewhere safer to hide, and it found the supercar. Prices came loose from all reason. Certain exotics rose roughly tenfold in around 30 months. The Ferrari F40, listed at close to £200,000, was changing hands for 4, 6, even 8 times that figure. Not because anyone longed to drive it, but because someone else would pay more for it tomorrow. A brand new Jaguar supercar, strictly limited, world's fastest, with a £50,000 entry ticket, was not really a car to these buyers at all. It was a financial instrument, an appreciating asset with scissor doors, a place to park a fortune and watch it swell. It is hard now to convey how ordinary all this had come to feel. Grown men who understood money treated a limited edition supercar the way an earlier generation had treated gold or land, as a store of value that only ever climbed. Deposits changed hands before the cars behind them existed. Places on waiting lists were traded at a premium. The car itself, the actual machine of metal and leather and noise, had become almost beside the point. What mattered was the certificate that said you owned one and the quiet certainty that some other buyer, further back in the queue, would one day pay handsomely to take it off you. The whole glittering structure rested on a single unspoken assumption that the good times were not going to end. That is the quiet tragedy sitting beneath the triumph of that October afternoon, and it is worth being precise about it, because everything that followed flowed from here. The people cheering the XJ220 and the people investing in the XJ220 were, for the most part, not the same people. The enthusiasts loved the car. The speculators loved the number they believed it would become. And Jaguar, giddy with the sensation it had caused, took the money of both without ever quite reckoning how different the two really were. There was a trap hidden inside the triumph, though nobody felt it yet. Jaguar had promised the world a specific car, a V12, 4 driven wheels, doors that reached for the sky, and the world had answered with a roar and a mountain of cash. Every one of those 1,500 people had fallen for a particular machine, the one under the lights at Birmingham. That promise was now made, in public, to some of the wealthiest and most litigious people on earth. The trouble was that keeping it, exactly as shown, might prove impossible, and breaking it, even a little, might prove unforgivable. Because here was the thing all the champagne obscured. The car that had caused this hysteria did not, in any real sense, yet exist. What sat on that turntable was a concept, a magnificent, hand-built, one-off statement of intent. It had been dreamed up by 12 men in their spare time to prove a point. Nobody had worked out how to manufacture it. Nobody had costed the tooling, sourced a production line, or squared that heavy racing V12 with the tightening European emissions rules it would soon have to meet. The Saturday Club had built a miracle. But turning a miracle into a product, one that could be built hundreds of times over, to a price, to a schedule, to a standard fit to hand a knight of the realm, was an entirely different order of engineering. And it was plainly not a job for a dozen exhausted volunteers working nights at Brown's Lane. It was a job for a hard-nosed racing outfit that knew how to turn ambition into hardware and hit a deadline while it did so. As it happened, Jaguar owned half of exactly such an outfit, the very same lean, ferociously effective team that had just won at Le Mans. It was run by one of the most relentless operators British motorsport has ever produced. His name was Tom Walkinshaw, and the moment the dream passed out of Jim Randall's hands and into his, it began, quietly, reasonably, one sensible decision at a time, to change. Chapter 4. The Racer. Thomas Dobby Thompson Walkinshaw was born on the 14th of August 1946 at Maudsley in the Scottish Lowlands, and he was, from the very beginning, a man who did not much care for losing. He had come up as a racing driver, quick, fearless and cannier than most about the machinery beneath him, but his real gift turned out to be for organisation. In 1976, he founded his own team and gave it his own name, TWR, Tom Walkinshaw Racing. Within a decade, it had grown into one of the most formidable motorsport operations on Earth. The proof was written in the record books. In 1984, Walkinshaw won the European Touring Car Championship himself, at the wheel of a big, unlikely Jaguar XJS, a car most people thought of as a boulevard cruiser, which he turned into a race winner by sheer force of will. Then came the sports cars, and with them the prize that mattered most to Coventry, Le Mans. It was a Walkinshaw car, in Jaguar's colours, that had ended the Marquis's 30-year exile from the winner's circle in 1988. He would win the 24 Hours for Jaguar again in 1990. By then, TWR employed around 1,500 people across bases in Britain, Sweden, Australia and the United States. It designed, it built, it raced, and it won. To understand what happened to the XJ220, you have to understand the difference between the two men now bound to its fate. Jim Randall was a romantic, an engineer who had built a Le Mans car on his kitchen table out of love. Tom Walkinshaw was a realist, an operator who measured everything against a stopwatch and a balance sheet, and who had a reputation, richly earned, for being immovable once he had made up his mind. John Egan, who dealt with him often, remembered that the only time he ever found Walkinshaw yielding on the question of money was just after the Scot had hauled himself, spent and exhausted, out of a race car following a long stint at the wheel. Even then, Egan noted dryly, the man was canny. This was the figure into whose hands the dream now passed. When it came to the question of who could actually build the XJ220, who could take the Saturday Club's miracle and turn it into a car you could sell hundreds of times over, to a standard fit for a king, there was only ever going to be one answer. Jaguar and TWR formed a company between them, owned 50-50, and called it Jaguar Sport. Production was announced in 1989, and with that announcement, the character of the whole enterprise quietly began to change. It was, in a sense, a marriage of opposites. On one side stood Coventry, gentlemanly, romantic, steeped in half a century of history and a certain wounded pride. On the other stood a lean Scottish race shop that cared nothing for history and everything for results, that would strip any sentiment out of a problem until only the engineering and the economics remained. For the men at TWR, the XJ220 was not a sacred object. It was a job, a difficult, fascinating, prestigious job, but a job with a budget and a deadline to be delivered like any other. There was ambition in it for Walkinshaw too, beyond the fee. A man who had already conquered touring cars and sports cars did not take on a road car program of this scale purely as a favour to Coventry. Building the XJ220 was a chance to prove that TWR could do more than win races, that it could design and manufacture a complete motorcar from the raw tub to the finished cabin, and place it in the hands of the wealthiest customers on Earth. For a race team, that was a door into a very much larger room. Walkinshaw fully intended to walk through it, because a racer does not look at a car the way a dreamer does. Where Randall saw a statement of intent, Walkinshaw's engineers saw a list of problems to be solved to a price. They took the concept away and studied it, coldly, as a thing that had to be manufactured in the real world under real laws. And their feasibility study came back with an answer that would, in time, ignite everything. The car as shown, the great racing V12, the four-driven wheels, could not sensibly be built. It was too heavy. It was too complex. It was too expensive. And it was increasingly at odds with the emissions rules bearing down on Europe, rules a big racing V12 would struggle to meet. In its place, they proposed something leaner and cleverer, a twin turbocharged V6, drive to the rear wheels alone, and a body reworked to suit. The four-wheel drive posed its own quiet nightmare. Sending power to the front wheels of a mid-engined car meant threading the drive forward through and around the engine itself, a fiendishly complicated arrangement that piled on weight and cost and gave a dozen more things the chance to fail. Strip it out, drive the rear wheels alone as a racing car does, and the whole machine grew simpler, lighter, and, the engineers were quietly certain, quicker. Every deletion had a reason. Every reason was sound. That, in the end, was exactly what would make the anger, when it finally came, so very hard to answer. Whether that decision was a betrayal or a rescue is the question this whole film will have to weigh, and we will weigh it properly when the moment comes. For now, hold only this. The men who made that call were not vandals, and they were not fools. They were among the finest engineers and hardest operators in the business, and they believed, with good reason, that they were saving the XJ220, not from Randall, but from the sheer impossibility of Randall's ambition. What no feasibility study on Earth could save it from was the world outside the factory gates, which was, even then, beginning to turn. But that reckoning was still years away. First, there was a car to build, and to build it, Walkinshaw's people needed somewhere to build it. Chapter 5. A factory called Bloxham. They found there somewhere in the gentle Oxfordshire countryside, near Banbury, a purpose-built plant at Wycombe Mill, in the village of Bloxham. It was not a grand old works, with a century of soot in its bricks and a hooter that ruled the lives of a town. There was no terraced housing crowded up against its walls, no generations of the same families clocking in through the same gates. It was new and clean and quiet, and it smelled of fresh concrete and paint rather than of oil and history. And yet, in its own modest way, it became, for a few short years, one of the most remarkable places in all of British manufacturing. A small factory in a field where a few hundred people set themselves the task of hand-building the fastest car in the world. The man charged with making it happen was Mike Morton, and if ever a project called for his particular blend of talents, this was the one. Morton had spent 23 years at Ford, and a spell at Vauxhall before that. He understood in his bones both the relentless discipline of mass production and the wild one-off improvisation of the racing world, and the XJ220 demanded both of those things at the same time, which is a very hard thing to ask of any factory. He assembled a team that drew from each tradition, setting men who had built family cars by the 100,000 to work alongside men who had built race cars one at a time, and pointing the whole lot of them at a target that sat awkwardly between the two, a car built with a craftsman's patient hands to a racer's unforgiving tolerances, in numbers small enough to feel bespoke and large enough to matter to a balance sheet. The caliber of mind the enterprise drew in tells you something about the moment. Among the engineers who passed through the TWR sports car program in those years was a quiet, methodical young man named Ross Brawn, a name that would one day be spoken with something close to reverence in the highest reaches of Formula One. Bloxham, for all its rural stillness, was not a backwater or an afterthought. It was, for a few remarkable years, one of the places where some of the best people in the business came to attempt something that had not quite been attempted before. There was an intimacy to it that the great car plants had long since surrendered. In a place this size, everyone knew what everyone else was doing. A problem on the shop floor could be carried, in a matter of minutes, to the very man whose decision would solve it. The whole car passed, in effect, through one set of hands and one mind at a time, unhurried and unhidden. It was the precise opposite of the anonymous production line, and for the people fortunate enough to work there, it was the sort of job a person remembers for the rest of their life. Walk into that factory in 1991, and the first thing you would have understood, before you understood anything else, is that this was a place of patience. There was very little of the noise and violence you might picture from a car plant, no great presses slamming down every few seconds, no rivers of half-built shells crawling past on an endless line, no shower of sparks from ranks of automated welders swinging on their arms. What there was, instead, was quiet, careful, deliberate, human work, of a kind that had all but vanished from the rest of the motor industry. Consider how the thing was actually made. The XJ220's central structure, the strong bathtub of a shell that everything else was hung upon, was not stamped from steel in the time it takes to read this sentence. It was built up from aluminium honeycomb, light, immensely stiff panels, bonded together with adhesive and secured with rivets, assembled by hand piece by patient piece, in a process borrowed less from car making than from the building of aircraft. Over that skeleton went the skin, and the skin was a craftsman's affair from beginning to end. Aluminium body panels, hand-formed, wheeled and worked and fettled by men who could read the metal with their fingertips, each panel coaxed and beaten until it flowed into the next without a ripple or a seam out of place. A single car swallowed an enormous quantity of skilled human labor, the sort of labor that cannot be rushed without being wrecked. The men who did this work were a mixture, and the mixture was the whole point. Some had come out of Jaguar's own Coventry tradition, panel men and fitters who had served long apprenticeships and carried the Marquis' old standards in their hands. Others had come from the race shops, used to building one perfect thing at a time and then building the next one better still. A skilled panel beater on that floor might spend the better part of a day on a single wing, working it and rechecking it until the reflection of the strip lights ran clean and unbroken across the metal. Nobody was shouting. Nobody was hurrying. The work set its own pace, and its pace was slow because there is simply no fast way to make something this good by hand. And there, glowing quietly beneath the pride of it all, was the contradiction the racer had inherited. Jaguar had promised the world 350 of these cars, to a schedule, to buyers who were not remotely accustomed to being kept waiting. But every single thing that made the XJ220 magnificent, the hand-bonded honeycomb, the hand-formed alloy, the sheer size and intricacy of the machine, was precisely what made it slow and ruinously expensive to build. The men on that floor were building something they could put their names to and be proud of for the rest of their lives. Whether the arithmetic behind them added up was a worry that belonged to other men, in other rooms, higher up the chain. The engine, when it came together on the test benches, was a small triumph in its own right. Not the great theatrical V12 of the concept, its trumpets on display behind glass, but a compact, ferociously potent, twin-turbocharged V6, developed with all the hard-won knowledge that TWR had gathered in its racing program. We will return, in time, to exactly where that engine had come from, and to the storm its choice would raise, because it deserves a proper and honest hearing, rather than a cheap verdict. For now, it is enough to say this. When the engineers ran it up and read the figures off the dials, the numbers stopped the argument dead. This supposedly compromised car, this alleged betrayal of a dream, was going to be quicker than the dream itself had ever dared to promise. And then, at the very end of the long process, came the marriage of it all, the great V6 lowered into the waiting tub, the running gear bolted up, the hand-formed panels offered to the structure and made to sit just so, the Connolly leather drawn over the seats, until the cabin smelled less like a factory and more like a gentleman's study. When a completed car turned its wheels for the first time and its engine caught and settled into that hard, boosted idle, the men who had built it would stop and listen, because they knew exactly how much of themselves had gone into the making of that sound. Every car that left Bloxham carried away a small piece of everyone who had ever touched it. So the tubs were bonded, and the panels were beaten, and the engines howled on the dynamometers behind their soundproofed doors. And slowly, patiently, in that quiet green corner of Oxfordshire, the fastest car in the world came into being, one hand-built example at a time. Chapter 6. The fastest car in the world. By the time the finished production car was shown to the public in October 1991, the anticipation had been swelling for 3 long years. The XJ220 had lived all that while in the national imagination as a promise rather than a product, a rumour, a magazine cover, a low silver shape half glimpsed under a dust sheet. Now, at last, here it stood, real and finished, and the question the whole country wanted answered was the very question its name had posed from the first day. Was it, in plain fact, the fastest car in the world? Everything about it insisted that it was. It was enormous, longer than a limousine, wider than very nearly anything else on the road, so low that a grown man could lay his hand flat on the roof without stooping far. Standing perfectly still, it looked as though it were already travelling at 100 miles an hour. And beneath that hand-formed skin sat the engine that settled the doubters before they could open their mouths, giving up a figure that had no business coming from a car this civilized, some 542 brake horsepower. Set that against the concept's 500, and the awkward, inconvenient truth stood plainly revealed. The car the purists mourned, the four-wheel drive V12 that never reached the road, would have been the slower machine. The racer's cold arithmetic had not diminished the XJ220 at all. It had made it faster, For a certain generation of British schoolboy, none of this required any explanation whatsoever. The XJ220 was already up on the bedroom wall, tacked between the Ferraris and the Lamborghinis, and this was the thrilling part, entirely holding its own among them. It became a video game before it had turned a wheel in anger, its unmistakable silhouette rendered in the bright, blocky graphics of the home computers of the day, so that boys who would never in their lives sit in one could nonetheless drive it in their bedrooms. It was, for a season, the single most desirable object in Britain, not because anyone outside the trade understood its honeycomb tub or its boost pressures, but because it was ours, and it was the fastest, and after the long national humiliation of the 1970s, that combination went to the head like champagne. The press could hardly contain itself. The motoring magazines, which had watched the concept cause its sensation 4 years earlier, now had a finished car against which to measure the promise, and the measurements were staggering. Here was a British machine, from a firm that had been a national joke inside living memory, that outran the proudest names in Europe. Every road test, every cover, every breathless paragraph fed the growing sense that something quietly astonishing was happening in a field near Banbury, that the country which had invented the motor race, and then very nearly thrown its whole car industry away, was about to hold the outright speed record for the road. There is a particular kind of pride a country takes in being, demonstrably, the best in the world at one hard and specific thing. For a few short months, at the dawn of the 1990s, Britain held that pride in the shape of a low silver car built by a few hundred people in a field in Oxfordshire. The finest of Italy could not touch it. The finest of Germany could not touch it. Whatever else would come to be said about the XJ220, then, and for years afterwards, this much was true and unarguable, and gloriously, defiantly, British. Nobody, anywhere on the planet, was building a road car that could keep up with it. All that remained was to prove it, not on a computer screen, not on a test bench behind a soundproofed door, but out in the open, against the clock, in front of witnesses who could not be doubted. And so, Jaguar Sport went looking for the fastest road on Earth. Chapter 7. 217. There had already been a warning of what the car could do. In 1991, before the Great Record attempt, a prototype XJ220 had been taken to the most feared stretch of tarmac in the world. The old Nürburgring, the Nordschleife, 14 miles of narrow, plunging, tree-lined German racetrack that has broken cars and drivers for a century, and had lapped it in a little under 7 minutes and 47 seconds. For those who understood what that meant, it was all the proof they needed. But a lap time is an argument for enthusiasts. A top speed is a headline the whole world can read, and the whole world was waiting for the number in the name. They found the road they needed in the heel of Italy, near the town of Nardo, a vast, banked, circular test track built for exactly this purpose, a place where a car could be held flat to the floor lap after lap after lap without ever meeting a corner in the ordinary sense of the word. In June 1992, a Jaguar XJ220 arrived at Nardo to settle, once and for all, the question its badge had been asking for 4 years. The first runs were made with the car precisely as a paying customer would receive it. Catalytic converters fitted, everything road legal and in its proper place. Even so burdened, the figure that came back, verified by Jaguar's own testing and reported by the journalist Gavin Green in the pages of Car magazine that August, was 212 miles an hour. That alone would have been enough. No production car in history had ever been officially timed travelling so fast, but there was more in it, and every man there knew there was more in it. So they took the catalytic converters off, they raised the limiter that held the engine back past 7,900 revolutions a minute, and they handed the car to someone who knew exactly what to do with it. Martin Brundle, the British Formula One driver who had won Le Mans for Jaguar only 2 years before. Brundle put his foot to the floor and kept it there, around and around the great banked bowl, faster and faster, until the timing equipment recorded the number that would go into the record books and stay there. 217 miles an hour. Some 349 kilometers an hour. The fastest a standard production car had ever been made to go. That was the crown, claimed at last in the open, in broad daylight, with the motoring press of 2 continents standing witness. Journalists from Car and from America's Road and Track, present to see it happen, and to write it down so that no one could ever wave it away. The Guinness Book of World Records took the figure and set the XJ220 down as the fastest standard production car in the world, an entry it would carry. edition after edition, through the middle years of the decade. Back in Oxfordshire, the men who had bonded the tubs and beaten the panels heard the number and understood exactly what it meant. They had built the fastest car in the world. Not the fastest British car, not the fastest for the money. The fastest, full stop, anywhere on the planet. For a workforce drawn from an industry that had spent the best part of 2 decades being told it had lost its way, there are not many finer things a person can be given to say. And here is the detail that tells you how much the car had held in reserve. Nadeau is a circle. A car going round it is forever turning, forever leaning on the banking, never quite able to pour everything it has into pure forward speed the way it could down a long, flat, straight road. Brundle, who had felt for himself what the machine still had left, reckoned that on a straight surface it would have gone faster yet. Past 220, the very number that had been stamped into its name from the beginning, back when it was only a dream on Jim Randall's kitchen table. The XJ220 had not merely lived up to its promise, it had beaten it with something still in hand. The rain could not last forever, and it did not. A few years later, at a proving ground in Germany, a driver named Andy Wallace, a man who had himself driven the XJ220 to comfortably beyond 200 miles an hour, would take the extraordinary McLaren F1 to 240 and carry the record off with him. But that lay in the future. In the summer of 1992, the fastest road car ever built was British. It had been built by a few hundred patient people in a quiet Oxfordshire village, and for one clear, shining moment, every doubt about the engine, the drivetrain, the compromises, the whole fraught road from a cardboard model to the banking at Nadeau fell silent before the sheer, undeniable, world-beating fact of the thing. The car was everything it had ever promised to be. It was the fastest machine on 4 wheels anywhere on Earth, and it had arrived 4 years too late, because the world that had stood and roared at the Silver Concept in Birmingham in 1988, that confident, money-drunk, upward-only world of the late 80s boom, was gone. While Bloxham had patiently bonded its honeycomb and beaten its alloy, while TWR had chased its record round the Italian banking, something had given way out in the wider economy, quietly at first and then all at once. The fastest car in the world was ready at last to be handed to the people who had queued 4 years earlier to buy it. And those people, it was about to turn out, no longer wanted it at all. Chapter 8. The ground shifts. The trouble with a boom is that it feels, while it lasts, like the natural order of things. The men and women who had pressed their £50,000 checks on Jaguar in 1988 had done so in a world where the value of a beautiful car only ever climbed. That world did not last, and in the 4 long years it took to turn the Silver Concept into a car you could actually drive, the ground shifted beneath everyone standing on it. The recession came first, and it came hard. Across 1990 and 1991, the long party of the late 80s ended, and the exotic car market, that strange fever of money-chasing metal, did not simply cool. It collapsed. The Ferrari F40s that had changed hands for 4 and 6 and 8 times their list price fell back to earth with a sickening speed. Even the bluest of blue-chip cars roughly halved in value. Fortunes built on paper turned back into paper almost overnight, and what had felt, only months before, like the safest bet in the world, that a beautiful, limited car could only ever be worth more tomorrow, became, in a single grim season, a cautionary tale whispered across the trade. The speculators who had bought the XJ220 as an appreciating asset, a fortune with scissor doors, now watched in horror as the asset evaporated. And the cruel part was that most of them had not even taken delivery yet. They had gambled on a rising tide, and the tide had gone out while their car was still being built by hand in a field in Oxfordshire. For the true enthusiasts among the buyers, this was painful but survivable. They had wanted the car for itself, and it was still coming. For the speculators, it was ruin. They had never really wanted a car at all. They had wanted a profit, a quick and certain profit, and now the profit had curdled into a loss so large it took the breath away. Every month that Bloxham spent perfecting its aluminium was another month the market fell further beneath them. By the time their cars were ready, these men were not looking forward to delivery. They were looking for a way out. That alone would have been enough to wound the XJ220. But a second blow landed at almost the same moment, and it struck at the very heart of Jaguar itself. In September 1989, John Egan stood before the figures and delivered the bad news. Jaguar's profits had slumped from £22.5 million to just £1.5. Its worst result since the company had been set free 5 years earlier. The recovery that had felt so miraculous was faltering, and a wounded Jaguar, its share price soft, its independence guaranteed only by a government golden share due to expire, was suddenly a target. Ford moved. On the 19th of September 1989, the American giant launched an all-cash offer for the whole of Jaguar, £13.35 for every share, valuing the company at some £1.6 billion, a premium of around a third over the market price. Ford's man in Europe reckoned, with brutal candour, that it would probably have cost his company more to build from scratch what it was buying. The government removed the golden share. The Trade and Industry Secretary, Nicholas Ridley, cleared the way. There was a certain symbolism in that. The golden share had been the state's promise that Jaguar, newly freed, would stay British and stay its own master for a while, a shield held over a fragile national treasure. Now the shield was lowered, deliberately, by the very government that had raised it, and the treasure passed into foreign hands with the state's blessing. It was all perfectly legal, perfectly orderly, and it marked the quiet end of Jaguar as a company that answered to nobody but itself. The friendly deal was agreed that autumn, and on the 2nd of January 1990, Jaguar's shares were delisted. After 5 short years of freedom, Coventry belonged to Detroit. It was, in the language of the city, a takeover agreed rather than forced, and it valued Jaguar at some $2.33 billion, a figure that startled even seasoned observers. Ford believed it was buying something it could never build for itself. A name, a heritage, a certain magic that no amount of Detroit money could conjure out of nothing. And nothing embodied that magic more completely or more expensively than the unbuilt supercar it was inheriting along with everything else. Ford was not a villain in this story. It paid a fair price, and it would, in time, pour money into Jaguar that the little company could never have found alone. But Ford was a mass-market car maker, and it ran things the mass-market way. It installed its own people. It brought its own disciplines. And there was little room, in that new order, for the kind of after-hours romantic who built Le Mans cars out of cardboard on his kitchen table. The men who had thrived in the freewheeling, improvisational Jaguar of the 80s, the Jaguar that let a director build a supercar off the books because the idea was a good one, found themselves in a colder and more careful company, where such things simply did not happen. The Saturday Club had been possible precisely because the old Jaguar had a little romance in it, and a little slack. The new Jaguar had neither. It had budgets and reporting lines and Americans. Jim Randall, the man who had dreamed the whole thing, left his post as Jaguar's chief engineer in 1991, 2 years after the takeover, as Ford's appointees moved into the key positions. He put it later with characteristic understatement. Playtime was over. 2 words and a whole world inside them. The man who had conceived the XJ220 in his imagination in 1984, who had built it out of cardboard and favours and the loyalty of 11 friends, walked away from the company he had served for a quarter of a century just as his greatest creation was about to reach the public. He would not be there to defend it when the storm broke. The romantic was gone, and the car he had dreamed was left in the hands of the realists to face a reckoning that none of them had made, and none of them could now stop. Consider the awful timing of it all. The XJ220 had been conceived as the crowning glory of a proud, independent, reborn Jaguar. By the time it was ready to be delivered, the Jaguar no longer existed. The company was American-owned, cost-conscious, and increasingly embarrassed by a hugely expensive supercar it had inherited from a more flamboyant age. A car aimed at exactly the sort of wealthy speculator who had just been wiped out by the crash. The glamour that had helped justify Ford's enormous check was curdling, before anyone's eyes, into a liability. Within Ford's vast empire, the XJ220 was an oddity nobody had asked for, a fabulously expensive, low-volume vanity project inherited from the previous regime, aimed squarely at the class of buyer the recession had just annihilated. It still had powerful champions and a factory full of people determined to finish it properly, but it no longer had a company built in its own image standing behind it. In the space of 2 years, it had become an orphan of a vanished age, and the buyers had not yet seen what 4 years of hard, sensible engineering had done to the car they thought they had bought. Chapter 9. The Engine Question. Here we arrive at the accusation that sits at the very centre of this story. The thing the title promises was the fatal mistake. They took out the V12, the accusation runs, and they put in a rally engine from an Austin Metro. It is a devastating line. It is repeated to this day. And it is, in almost every particular that matters, wrong. Let us take it apart honestly, because the truth is more interesting than the myth. Start with the V12 that was lost. It was a glorious thing, that great racing engine behind its pane of glass. But it was also heavy, and it was thirsty, and it was walking straight into a wall of tightening European emissions law that a big, old architecture racing 12 would have struggled to climb. Keeping it would have made the XJ220 heavier, dirtier, and harder to sell in the markets that mattered. The engineers at TWR looked at it clearly and concluded it had to go. That was not vandalism. That was judgment. And it is worth being fair to the men who made that call because history has not been. They were not accountants butchering a masterpiece to save a few pounds. They were racing engineers, some of the very best in the world, who wanted the XJ220 to be the fastest and finest thing it could possibly be, and who understood, as the romantics did not, that a car which cannot be built or cannot be sold or cannot pass an emissions test is not really a car at all. It is a sculpture. Now the engine that replaced it, and here is where the myth falls apart. In 1989, TWR acquired the rights to a compact V6 that had been designed by David Wood, an engineer who had cut his teeth at Cosworth. Wood had created it for the MG Metro 6R4, a ferocious little rally car, and when the sport banned that whole class of machine in 1987, his engine was left an orphan, a brilliant design with nowhere to go. There is a small tragedy in Wood's engine too. He had built it for a car, the wild four-wheel drive, mid-engined Metro 6R4 that was meant to conquer world rallying, only for the sports authorities to outlaw the entire breed of monster it belonged to after a single terrible season of accidents. His masterpiece was orphaned before it had ever had the chance to prove itself. That TWR gave it a second life, and a second and far greater fame in the fastest road car in the world is one of the happier accidents in this whole unhappy story. But what TWR did with it was not to drop it into the XJ220 as it was. That is the crucial point the myth gets wrong. Under a powertrain manager named Andrew Barnes, working within Alan Scott's operation, with a gifted Swiss engine builder called Max Heidegger, among those turning the spanners, TWR took Wood's design and rebuilt it, comprehensively, into something new. They bored it out and stretched it to 3.5 litres. They hung twin Garrett turbochargers off it. They cast it in aluminium, gave it a steel crank and steel rods, and wrapped it in modern electronic engine management. And, when they had finished, this compact twin-turbo 6 produced some 542 brake horsepower. Picture the test cell the first time they ran it in anger, the shriek of it building through the soundproofed walls, the needles climbing past anything the old V12 had ever reached, the engineers glancing at one another as the figure settled on the readout. Whatever else this engine was, it was a monster. It made more power than the thing it replaced, and it did so from 2/3 of the cylinders and a great deal less weight. This was not a rally engine, not anymore. By the time it reached the XJ220, it was a bespoke, race-bred unit that had already proved itself in the heat of competition, powering TWR's own XJR10 and XJR11 sports prototypes. These were not road cars softened for comfort. They were purpose-built endurance races, and the V6 had been hammered in them at racing speeds, over racing distances, and had held together. The Swiss engine builder Max Heidegger, one of the men who assembled those competition units, knew every internal secret the thing possessed. What went into the back of the XJ220 was, in truth, far closer to a detuned sports prototype engine than to anything you could buy in a showroom. The rally car was its distant ancestor. Its immediate parents had raced at Le Mans. It was lighter than the V12. It was more compact than the V12. It was more powerful than the V12. And it was vastly more economical, capable, when driven gently, of something close to the fuel consumption of an ordinary saloon, where the 12 would have drunk fuel like a thing possessed. There is even a smaller myth nested inside the big one. The persistent tale, that the engine was a cut-down Rover V8. It was nothing of the kind. That story survives only because a six-cylinder version of a Rover V8 had once been used in the earliest development mules of the 6R4, years before, in a different life. It has nothing to do with the engine that powered the XJ220. The decisive voice in all of this was Tom Walkinshaw's. He was the one who looked at the romantic V12 and the pragmatic V6 and chose, without sentiment, the engine that made the better car. One can imagine the meeting where it was settled, the romantics making the case for the Great 12, the number that had drawn the crowds and filled the order books, and Walkinshaw, unmoved, laying out the weight, the cost, the emissions, and the simple, stubborn fact that the 6 was faster. He was not a man you argued with easily, and on this he did not need to be. The engineering agreed with him. The only thing that did not agree with him was the heart, and Tom Walkinshaw had never been in the business of building cars for the heart. He was in the business of winning. And here is the hard, uncomfortable truth that the eulogist is bound to tell. On the engineering merits, he was right. The supposed betrayal produced a faster, lighter, cleaner, more usable machine. The mistake at the heart of the title delivered the fastest production car in the world. But engineering is not the same thing as feeling. And a man who had been promised a great 12-cylinder Jaguar engine and was now being handed a turbocharged 6 with a rally car somewhere in its family tree, did not reach for the dyno sheets. He reached for the word downgrade. He had been sold a dream with 12 cylinders in it, and the dream now had 6. No amount of horsepower could quite answer that feeling, and the feeling, in the end, would matter more than the facts. You cannot argue a person out of a feeling like that with a dyno sheet. The engineers had the numbers, and the numbers were entirely on their side, and it made not the slightest difference. Prestige is not measured on a dynamometer. A V12 meant something. It meant 12 cylinders worth of extravagance, 12 cylinders worth of belonging to the most exclusive club in all of motoring. 6 cylinders and a pair of turbochargers, however brilliant, however fast, simply did not say the same thing across a dinner table. And these were people for whom what the car said across a dinner table was rather the entire point. And so the finest decision the engineers made became, in the eyes of the people who mattered most, the original sin of the whole enterprise. The truth that the V6 was the better engine, the right engine, the engine that made the XJ220 the fastest car in the world, was buried beneath a feeling of having been shortchanged. It would take the better part of 30 years, and a whole new generation who cared about how the car drove rather than what its badge implied, for that truth to be dug back up again. Chapter 10. Everything they took away. The engine was only the beginning of the subtractions. One by one, in the name of making the car buildable, the features that had made the concept a sensation were quietly taken away. The 4 driven wheels went first, for all the reasons the engineers had laid out: the fearsome complexity, the weight, the cost of threading power to the front of a mid-engined car. In their place, drive to the rear wheels alone. On paper, again, a better car, simpler, lighter, quicker. On the page of a sales brochure, another thing the buyer had been promised and would not now receive. The scissor doors went next. Those theatrical panels that had risen towards the ceiling at Birmingham, that had launched 1,000-bedroom posters, were replaced by ordinary doors that opened outward like any other cars. The dimensions changed. The 4-wheel steering and the other clever adaptive touches quietly disappeared from the specification. By the accounts of the men who designed it, Walkinshaw drove these deletions hard, stripping away feature after feature that the stylists and the romantics wanted to keep, arguing in his blunt Scottish way that every Grammy and every pound saved was a Grammy and a pound toward the only things that mattered, making the car buildable and making it quick. Keith Helfert and the Jaguar men fought their corner where they could, but it was Walkinshaw's factory now, Walkinshaw's budget, Walkinshaw's deadline. The dreamers had had their day at Birmingham. This was the racer's day, and the racer won every argument that came down to cost against beauty. Each deletion had its reason. Each reason was sound, and each one chipped quietly at the fantasy the buyers had fallen in love with. Then came the details that would become notorious, the small economies that, to a furious customer, said everything. To keep the costs in check, Jaguar Sport reached into the parts bins of the wider motor industry, as every car maker does. But the parts they reached for were not chosen to flatter. The door mirrors came from a Citroën. The rear light clusters came from a Rover 200, a modest family hatchback. A buyer who had committed the price of a country house to the fastest car in the world could walk around the back of it and find himself looking at the taillights of a car his secretary might drive. It was a small thing. It felt like an insult. That, in miniature, was the whole tragedy of the production XJ220. Everything the engineers did to make it real and buildable, the buyer read as a corner cut, a promise broken, a cheapening of the dream. The Rover tail lights were sound, sensible engineering. Why tool up a bespoke lamp when a perfectly good one already existed? But sound, sensible engineering was not what £50,000 deposits had been placed upon. Those deposits had been placed on magic, and magic does not survive contact with a parts bin. And there was the matter of time, working its own quiet damage. 4 years is a long while to wait for anything. It is an eternity to wait for a fantasy. In 1988, the buyer had been swept up in a single dazzling moment. The lights, the crowd, the sensation, the certainty of buying into the future. By 1992, that moment was cold ash. The world had turned, the boom had broken, and the car that finally arrived had to be judged not against the fever of the show hall, but against the grey daylight of a recession. Almost nothing could have survived that comparison. The XJ220 certainly did not, and over all of it hung the price, which had done the one thing a price should never do to a nervous, angry customer in a crashing market. It had gone up. The figure announced had been in the region of £361,000. But the contract carried an index linking clause, and as the build dragged on, that clause did its quiet, remorseless work. By the time the cars were ready to be delivered, the price had climbed to somewhere between £400,000 and £470,000. There was a bitter machinery in that. The index linking clause had seemed reasonable enough when it was signed, in a world where everything only ever rose, but it took no account whatsoever of a world that fell. So as the value of the car collapsed, month by month, the price the buyer owed for it did the exact opposite. It rose, mechanically, remorselessly, indifferent to the catastrophe unfolding all around it. The contract climbed as the market sank. Few clauses in the whole history of motoring have been so exquisitely, so accidentally cruel. Set that against the wreckage of the market outside, where a Ferrari F40, a car of shattering glamour and impeccable pedigree, could now be had for under £200,000, and the arithmetic became unbearable. Stand in the buyer's shoes for a moment and add it all up. He had been promised a V12. He was getting a Turbo 6. He had been promised 4-wheel drive. He was getting 2. He had been promised doors that reached for the sky. He was getting ordinary ones, and Rover tail lights, and Citroën mirrors. And for this diminished dream, he was now being asked to pay very nearly double what he had expected, for a car that the moment it was built was worth a fraction of its price. Every single one of those decisions, taken on its own, was defensible. Some were more than defensible. They were the right call, made by good engineers under real pressure to save a car that might otherwise never have been built at all. But a customer does not experience decisions one at a time, weighed on their individual merits. He experiences their sum, and the sum, arriving in the middle of an economic catastrophe, read to the people who had queued in 1988 as something with a very old and ugly name. Bait and switch. That was what they called it, and they went to war. Chapter 11. Suing the Faithful. The first cars were delivered in July 1992. They were worth less than their price before they left the factory. In a market that had crashed, a £400,000 Jaguar was, the instant it changed hands, a car you could not sell for anything like £400,000. For the enthusiasts who had wanted one to keep and to love, that was a private sorrow. For the speculators who had bought one to flip, it was a financial disaster, and they had no intention of completing the purchase. Imagine being the salesman who had to make those telephone calls, ringing a customer to arrange delivery of the car of his dreams, and being told, flatly, that there would be no delivery, no final payment, no thank you, only a solicitor's address, and a fight. The people who had celebrated together in Birmingham were now on opposite sides of a quarrel, and there was no way back to how it had felt on that first bright afternoon. A couple of dozen of them, by Jaguar's own account, simply refused to make the second payment. Some tried to walk away from their contracts altogether, to abandon their deposits and be gone. It began as a trickle and became a flood of bad feeling. A letter here, a returned invoice there, a solicitor's note explaining ever so politely that the client would not be completing. Then, another and another. £50,000 already handed over was, to these people, a far smaller loss than the 300,000 or 400,000 still owed on a car worth a fraction of the price. Walking away, forfeiting the deposit, was the rational choice, and so, one by one, they walked. Jaguar refused to let them. And so, the most extraordinary reversal in the whole story took place. The company that people had physically queued to give money to 4 years earlier now issued writs against those same people. The firm that had been begged to take £50,000 cheques was now dragging its own customers into the High Court to force them to pay. The champagne of Birmingham had turned in less than half a decade to the cold language of litigation. Think of what that meant for the people caught inside it. David Boole, the affable public affairs man who had once marvelled at £10 million of free publicity, was now the company's voice in a sordid public quarrel with its own customers. The salesmen who had taken those eager cheques were now names on legal correspondence. And the buyers, the celebrities, the aristocrats, the financiers who had once counted themselves among the anointed few, were now defendants, fighting to escape the very thing they had begged to be allowed to buy. There is no dignity anywhere in that picture. Only two sides who had loved the same car for different reasons, tearing at one another in the ruins of a boom. The cases were mostly settled quietly, out of the public eye. But one left a mark in the law reports, and it is worth pausing on because of who was involved. The defendants were French, the Comte d'Uzès and the Comte de Dampierre, aristocratic names from another age, being pursued through an English court over a British supercar. Part of the legal argument turned on a question almost comic in its details, whether men of such enormous wealth, buying a machine like this, could possibly be considered ordinary consumers, deserving of a consumer's protections. It is a detail almost too neat to be true. French counts in an English court over a British Jaguar, arguing about whether a man rich enough to buy the fastest car in the world could really be called an ordinary consumer in need of protection from it. But that was the strange, rarefied altitude at which this whole dispute unfolded. These were not ordinary people wronged in an ordinary way. They were among the wealthiest individuals alive, fighting over a machine most of the country could only ever dream of, in the wreckage of a boom that had made and unmade fortunes overnight. Elsewhere, another disgruntled depositor, Michael Pearson, who would later become the 4th Viscount Cowdray, threatened a counterclaim, arguing that Jaguar had devalued his XJ220 by launching a rival in-house supercar, the XJR15, to compete with it. The buyers had grievances, and some of them were heartfelt. But when the matter came to be tested, Jaguar held a card that trumped all of it, its own sales contract. Because for all the fury about the V12 that became a 6, and the 4 wheels that became 2, the contract that the buyers had actually signed, back in 1990 before any car was built, had told the truth. In black and white, it specified a race-developed twin-turbo 3.5-litre V6. It specified drive to the rear wheels. The buyer's case rested on the dazzling concept of 1988. The paper they had signed described, with complete honesty, the car they were now being asked to take. The misrepresentation, they alleged, simply was not there. And so Jaguar won. Here is the quiet, painful truth at the centre of the bait and switch. The truth the eulogist is bound to state plainly, even though it satisfies nobody. There was no swindle. The contract had been candid from the start. What there was, instead, was a collision between buyers who had fallen for a fantasy and then watched the market that made it valuable collapse, and a company that had, on paper at least, kept its word. It was not villainy on either side. It was buyer's remorse and a broken economy, meeting in a courtroom with lawyers in between. And caught in the middle, largely forgotten, were the genuine enthusiasts, the people who had queued in 1988, not to make money but because they loved the car, who took delivery and kept their word and drove the thing, and watched its value fall through the floor around them. They had done nothing wrong. They had simply wanted the fastest car in the world, and had been unlucky enough to want it at exactly the wrong moment in history. Nobody sued them. Nobody needed to. The market had already punished them for their loyalty. Having won, Jaguar did not, in the end, force the cars down its customers' throats. It allowed the reluctant depositors to buy their way out of their contracts instead, to pay a penalty and walk away without the car. Some paid to be released. Others, in the end, took their cars and made the best of it. But a good number of the 350 Dreams sold in a single afternoon in 1988 never found the owner who had ordered them. They stayed with the company that had built them, unwanted, waiting, an inventory of the finest supercars in the world, held not as trophies but as problems on a balance sheet. Every one of those unsold cars was a reproach. Here was the fastest machine on earth, the crowning achievement of British engineering, a car that had humbled Ferrari and Lamborghini and set a record that would stand for years, and it could not find a buyer at any price the company could bear to accept. There is no colder verdict a market can pass on a thing than simple, total indifference. That was the verdict now being passed on the XJ220. A hollow sort of victory, that. The company had proved it was in the right, and gained, for its trouble, a warehouse of unwanted supercars and a reputation in ruins. Word of the whole miserable affair spread far beyond the people directly involved, and it spread in the worst possible shape. The story told itself. Greedy Jaguar had lured in trusting buyers with a fabulous V12 Dream, then swapped it for something lesser and doubled the price, and when the buyers objected, had hauled them into court. That version was not fair, and it was not accurate. It did not matter. It was simpler than the truth, and far more satisfying to tell, and so it was the version that stuck, and stuck for the better part of 30 years. The fastest car in the world had become the most toxic name in the business, and there were still cars sitting unsold. Chapter 12. The win they erased. Production limped on, and then, in 1994, it stopped. Of the 350 cars Jaguar had promised in the giddy days of the boom, only somewhere between 275 and 282 were ever built. Some of the last ones sat unsold for years, right through to around 1997, and were eventually let go at a fraction of their list price, reportedly for around £150,000 apiece, brand new, less than half of what the earlier buyers had been billed. It was a quiet humiliation for the fastest car in the world. Somewhere in a storage building, brand new examples of the fastest car in the world sat under dust sheets, unwanted, depreciating by the week, machines that a few years earlier 1,500 people had fought one another to own. That image, more than any courtroom, is the true low point of the story. The greatest British supercar of its age, gathering dust because nobody would take it even at a discount. And yet, even as the commercial story curdled, the car kept insisting on its own greatness, never more so than on the racetrack, where the XJ220 wrote itself one last, heartbreaking chapter. They built a racing version, the XJ220C, and it announced itself in the best possible way. On its competition debut at Silverstone in May 1993, with Wyn Percy at the wheel, it won. Then came the big one. 3 works cars were entered for the 1993 running of the 24 Hours of Le Mans, the very race that had started the whole dream in Jim Randall's imagination a decade before, in a newly created class for Grand Tourers. And one of them, driven by John Nielsen, David Brabham, and a young David Coulthard making the only Le Mans start of his career, won that class outright, finishing 15th overall against the fastest prototypes in the world. For a few glorious weeks, the XJ220 had its redemption. The car the market had mocked, the car the courts had fought over, had gone to the hardest race on earth and beaten everything in its class. In the imagination of every engineer who had bled for it at Bloxham, the scales had finally, gloriously, tipped back the right way. A Jaguar had gone to Le Mans and won. The dream, in a sense, had come true. And then, about a month later, they took it away. The car was disqualified. The issue was the catalytic converters. The road car carried them, the race car had run without them, and a senior official at the organising club had flagged the point at scrutineering before the race had even begun. The appeal that might have saved the result was filed outside the permitted time. On a technicality, the victory was struck from the record. Read that again and feel the weight of it. The last car Jaguar ever entered at Le Mans won its class, and was stripped of the win. The mark whose whole modern legend rested on that circuit was denied at the final moment, the one triumph that might have redeemed the entire XJ220 story. It is hard to imagine a more fitting emblem for a car that was, again and again, so nearly magnificent and so cruelly denied its due. There was a last flourish, the XJ220S, a stripped and hardened homologation special. Clothed in carbon fibre, its engine wound up to around 680 brake horsepower. Just 6 were made. A final, defiant statement from a car that never got the ending it deserved. 680 brake horsepower, a body of woven carbon fibre, a machine honed to the very edge of what a road could bear, and almost nobody left to buy it, because by then the name itself had become a warning. The XJ220S should have been a legend, spoken of in the same breath as the rarest and wildest cars ever to leave a British workshop. Instead, it was a whisper. 6 cars, built almost in spite of everything, for a world that had stopped listening. And then the factory fell quiet. But the story of Wycombe Mill, Bloxham, did not end there, and its second act carries an irony sharp enough to draw blood. The little factory in the Oxfordshire field passed to Aston Martin, and from September 1994, on the very floor where the XJ220 had been hand-built, Aston Martin began to build the DB7, the beautiful Ian Callum-designed car, championed onto Ford's board by the veteran Walter Hayes, that would save Aston Martin and sell more than 7,000 examples over the following decade. The birthplace of Jaguar's great commercial disaster became the cradle of a rival marque's glorious revival. Today the site carries a different name again, the Vantage Business Park. The ghosts of both cars folded quietly into the Oxfordshire quiet. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that. The factory built to make Jaguar's boldest dream became the place where a rival built the car that saved it. The same skilled hands, very likely, that had beaten aluminium for the XJ220 now beat it for the DB7. Nothing was wasted in the end, not the building, not the people, not the craft. Only the car that had started it all was allowed to slip for a while into the shadows. Walk that ground now, and you would never know. The assembly hall where a few hundred people once bonded honeycomb and beat aluminium by hand, where the fastest car in the world came into being one patient example at a time, gave way to other work, other names, other cars. The silver machines scattered to the four winds, some cherished, some hidden away, some, for a while, all but unwanted. Chapter 13. Forgiven. For a long time, the world did not forgive the XJ220. The wilderness years were bleak. The car that had commanded £400,000 and the fury of the courts became, within a decade, an embarrassment nobody wanted to be seen owning. In 2003, a near-perfect example with just 111 miles on the clock, a car that had barely been driven, sold for a mere £105,000. By the middle of the 2000s, you could find them advertised for under £80,000. The fastest car in the world had become one of the great bargains and one of the great punchlines of the used car pages. On television, Jeremy Clarkson cheerfully dismissed it as being about as advanced as a telegraph pole, shortly before it beat a modern Pagani in a drag race, which told you rather more about the car than the joke did. Through those cold years, the flame was kept alive by a small band of the faithful, specialists like Don Law Racing, who maintained and rebuilt and quietly improved the cars, who understood what they were long before the market did. When the original tyres became impossible to find, the manufacturer Bridgestone went back and recreated a bespoke compound especially for them in 2020. The people who knew never stopped believing, and slowly, then all at once, the world came round. The reappraisal, when it came, was total. Collectors began to see the XJ220 for what it had always been beneath the noise, an analogue, hand-built, brutally fast piece of British engineering, staggeringly underrated, and a relative bargain against the Italian exotics it had once humbled. The values climbed, and then they soared. In September 2021, one sold at Goodwood for around £460,000. A record. In the years since, the finest examples have crossed the £500,000 mark and kept going. The market that had broken the car had, at long last, forgiven it. More than forgiven it. Fallen in love with it. Exactly as those 1,500 people had. One October afternoon in Birmingham, when it was only a silver dream under the lights. The men who made it did not all live to see it. Tom Walkinshaw went on to the very top of motorsport, running the Benetton Formula One team, where he brought through a young engineer named Ross Brawn and later owning the Arrows team, which collapsed in 2002, taking much of his empire with it. TWR was gone. Walkinshaw himself died of cancer in December 2010 at Chipping Norton, not far from the Oxfordshire factory where his hardest, finest road car had been built. He was 64. Jim Randall lived longer and more gently, designing gas turbine hybrids, holding a professorship at Birmingham University, honoured at last as the quiet visionary he had always been. He died in July 2019. The romantic and the realist, the dreamer and the racer, both gone now, their strange, doomed, magnificent collaboration outliving them both. So we come back, at the end, to the promise in the title. One mistake. The single fatal decision that destroyed the fastest car in the world. There wasn't one. That is the honest verdict. And it is worth saying without flinching. The engine swap was not a mistake. It was good engineering that made a better car. The deletions were not treachery. They were the sober compromises required to build the thing at all. The bait and switch was not a swindle. It was a candid contract, meeting a market that had lost its mind, and it was settled in a courtroom Jaguar won. The true killer was never a decision at all. It was a recession, a wave of the wider world that no engineer at Browns Lane or Bloxham could have held back, arriving at the one moment guaranteed to do the most harm. What was lost was never really the car. The car survived and thrived and is loved now more than it ever was. What was lost was the world that first believed in it, the confident, hopeful, money-drunk Britain of 1988, that stood in a show hall and dared to imagine it could build the fastest thing on earth. It could. It did. The tragedy was only in the timing, and what remains, when all the writs and the auction hammers and the arguments have fallen silent, is the thing that was always the best of it, the ambition. A dozen tired engineers, working nights on their own time, out of nothing but love and cardboard and borrowed parts, reaching for something impossible. They caught it. For one shining moment, in a quiet field in Oxfordshire, Britain built the fastest car in the world. Everything else was just the world catching up.